Hey everybody, welcome back to another reasonable price prediction, the series where we try to figure out where your favorite altcoins could be headed. Now today we're looking at Litecoin, and before I get into this video, I'd like to prefix how much of an idiot I am, because this is the third time that I'm recording this video within the space of kind of an hour and a half, back to back. The first time my microphone wasn't on, and the second time I forgot to click the record button. So hopefully video's recording and so is audio, but yeah, so excuse me if I kind of seem a little all over the place, or if I refer to something that I haven't explained. It's probably because in my brain I'm remembering explaining it from one of my previous attempts. But with that out of the way, in this video I basically want to look at Litecoin on its US dollar chart in a very simplified kind of basic manner. I just want to point out a few things and compare them. And the first thing that kind of immediately draws your eye probably is these circles, and these represent the major and the minor bull run peaks of each cycle. Now I subscribe to the theory that every cycle, not just Litecoin, the general crypto space, Bitcoin mainly is where I draw that from, but the crypto space follows Bitcoin. But I would believe that we have a major and a minor bull run. And what that basically means is after the halving, we have our major bull run, which is where we put in the real big gains. That's where the whole crypto space blows up. And then we have our bear run, where we see a lot of those gains be retraced. And depending on the altcoin, sometimes we go lower than where we actually kind of moved up from. For Litecoin, this isn't the case. And then for the minor bull runs, we kind of see basically a smaller bull run, a smaller major bull run. But we often see these kind of two heads each cycle. And while we have a lot of data for Litecoin, we still don't have technically enough data for this first halving, but you can make the case that this was the major, that was the minor. In 2018 this was the major, and then 2019 this was the minor, and then 2021 was kind of the major, and 2023 we had our minor. So with that out of the way, I'd now like to kind of share a narrative that I would believe in, that Litecoin is following to some degree. And that is that we're seeing something very similar to the first halving, what we saw happen the first halving, play out now. And the first point is that if we take a look at these minor runs, where the peak is, these circles mark the peak. If we zoom in, we can see that the peak is at a very similar price to where we kind of also peaked out just before the halving. And if we zoom into, and this was at $5 back during the first halving, what a time to be alive, wouldn't be a bad price to buy. But if we zoom in to current day Litecoin, we can see that we are pretty close. And in fact, we put in our peak of this minor bull run at about $115. And then we very recently, about a month ago, came to a high of about $13, give or take. So that's one similarity. Another one, which funnily enough, we actually predicted on this channel, and it wasn't because of Litecoin, it was more because of Bitcoin. But basically every halving, we usually see some kind of a rally and some kind of a sell-off. And the sell-off usually takes place during the halving. Now last cycle, a lot of people were discrediting this because of COVID, and I think COVID basically caused it to happen a little while earlier. But if we zoom into what's currently happening, we had a couple of months before the halving, we had strong moves, a couple of green candles there. And we put in some really good price action, and then just before the halving, strong sell-off, and we come down to the bull market support band. Remember that, we come down to the bull market support band. If we zoom out and see what happened during the first halving that Litecoin experienced, we can see that about 2 months before the halving, we get these strong green candles, and we make good price movement. And then what happens 2 weeks before the halving? We get a strong sell-off down to the bull market support band. So we can see those are two very similar things playing out. We're reaching a similar height, and we're also having a similar move. So we're making a strong move up and returning to similar levels, not in terms of US dollar wise, but in terms of percentage moves and where we are in relation to the bull market support band. And if we want to take a look at, kind of 2021, the 2020 halving, we can see this just wasn't the case. This minor bull run went much higher than where we crossed the halving, than where this mini kind of peak was. And if we zoom in that what happened after the halving, you can see that we do have these 2 months of kind of good movements, followed by 1 week of bad movement. So you could argue that happens every halving. I have argued that before, and I would have said it in multiple of my videos. If you go back to kind of a month before the halving, if uploads that I would have made in March and February, I would have been saying this stuff, but that doesn't really matter anymore. Basically, this 2019 cycle doesn't really hold up, but you could make the case that if the black swan of COVID hadn't happened, which is what these 3 weeks represent, you could argue that we could have potentially come back up to this high in time for the halving and then get a retracement of the halving week. You could basically move these kind of weeks here, this 2-month period, up to, you know, basically a price of $140 where it was at this minor peak. But again, that's total speculation. We will never know. That's something you cannot prove. So it's kind of fruitless to speculate on it too much. And again, just to kind of provide a bit of more legitimacy to kind of these movements, we can see that more or less every cycle with our major and minor bull run, we follow a similar pattern. We get our peak, and we usually ride up the bull market support band for this. We then, soon after getting the peak, quickly drop below the bull market support band. Again, we don't have much data here, but we can see we basically ride it down here. Same way we ride it down here, and a very similar way we ride it down here. Now, this cycle has been considered one of the most drawn out cycles, but still ultimately the same thing happened. We had our peak, and while we had a couple of resurgence, you could argue we had resurgence here, but they weren't to the same degree, and they were much more squashed together. We basically, once we were below our bull market support band, we stayed below it until we came down to these lows. Once we came to these lows, we had a rally up, bull market support band inverts, we put in our minor peak. Once we put in our minor peak, we dropped down below the bull market support band with the occasional move above, and that is what we kind of have seen happening this cycle, and that's what we've kind of seen happen last cycle. Now, sorry, not last cycle, the first cycle. But the main thing with the first cycle was that after the minor bull run peak, instead of there being a huge move to the downside, like we've seen in 2019, 2020, we actually mainly traded sideways here, and the price basically traded the bull market support band. With a few exceptions, a couple of moves to the upside, sure, but ultimately it flatlined here. It was horizontal. There wasn't too much volatility. And this happened for basically 90 weeks, probably 80 weeks. We had this kind of flat line. And now last cycle we had much more volatility, but we've also seen that we're not very similar to last cycle so far. We're drawing a lot of similarities to this cycle. And while the first cycle, it was, like we said, 90 weeks from the peak to the start of the next bull run, the last cycle that we had back in 2020, this halving from the peak to the start of the next bull run, it took 71 weeks. So it was a shorter time frame, we had a lot more volatility. I often disregard people that blame COVID and say that you can't use this information because of COVID, but I do think it affected a few things. I do think that we probably would have continued to rally up here without COVID. We would have had this crash still, but I think it would have been at a higher level. I also think we would have had this bull run a lot later on if it hadn't been for COVID. Obviously, with all the stimulus, being printed, money was just flooded into the market. It was one of the best. It was the best bull run crypto will probably ever have in general, and because of that, it resulted in Litecoin putting in higher highs technically and higher lows. We can see it kind of has been sort of trading upwards for the last 2 cycles, but it could very easily break down below these levels, I feel like. And note that this is currently at a sort of $65 level low, so that would kind of be where the lowest Litecoin could go if this is going to hold, which again is an if. So then, of course, the next thing to come to is taking these time periods and applying them to what we've currently seen. Now, assuming this is the top, this is the bull markets, this is the minor bull market peak, we can take these 71 weeks and 90 weeks and apply them and see where it takes us. And the 71 weeks brings us to the end of the year, basically, early mid-November. And while this is definitely possible, I don't think the general economic space will actually be in a good enough condition at that point. I don't think we would be feeling the effects of quantitative easing if we even have it at that point. Now, most likely the Fed in America will be cutting rates at that point, but it usually takes a good 9 months for that to translate into the economy. However, if we went 90 weeks out, that would put us kind of end of March time, basically start of April, end of Q1, start of Q2. I can definitely see that being a time when we get a bull run, basically a year from now. It would line up with kind of the 4-year cycle where every 4 years we get a bull run. 2021 we get a bull run, 2017 we get a bull run, plus 4, that's 2025. It would also, funnily enough, coincide very much with when we got a bull run in 2017. It kicked off end of March. That's when it rallied up. So again, it keeps coming back to this first halving. For me, at least, it does anyway. I'm sure you can argue the case of why this current cycle is very similar to the last one. But for me, what I'm feeling, the narrative I'm giving to you, remember it is a narrative. It's based on logic, but it's still a narrative. It's rational, but it's a narrative. It keeps coming back to this. And I can't help but keep drawing similarity after similarity. So if we are going to maybe follow this, like I think we will, we can expect, give or take, from after the halving, 40 weeks of kind of nothing. And that would be following the bull market support band. Now, if we see, does the bull market support band move much from after the halving? So where it is at the halving, does it go much higher or lower than that? No, it literally stays at that price. It was $4 here. It stayed basically at $4 for the duration of those 40 weeks. So if we take the current price, or sorry, the bull market support band at the halving, it puts Litecoin at $80. I can very much see Litecoin trading at $80 for the duration of this time. I mean, we've seen it kind of stick to these ranges that it wants to sit at for months. And if we kind of, for example, if we take it from here, where Litecoin kind of ranged from 60 quid to 80 quid, it did this for 26 weeks. I can definitely see it doing kind of the same thing, but for a tiny bit longer here at the next bracket up. Maybe it's like $70 to $90. That's the range. I don't think that's unreasonable at all. But again, these are my thoughts, and I want you to take everything I say with a pinch of salt. I don't want you to just believe a random dude online, but I also don't want you to just disregard everything I say just because I'm not talking favorably maybe, or how you want to hear me talk about maybe your favorite altcoin. I think it's important that you understand my rationale and my thinking process when it comes to these coins, so that you can interpret what I give you in a way that potentially filters out my bias, so that you can formulate your own decisions and predictions and thoughts on where you think whatever coin we're looking at might be going. I do think it's important to think, you know what I mean? Not just listen and hope. But either way, I've talked long enough about the US dollar pair. Looking at the Bitcoin chart now, I love this chart, to be honest with you, because every time I pull it up, it just, man, it just makes me feel despair for Litecoin, to be honest with you. I mean, you know, like, Litecoin's all-time high against Bitcoin was in November of 2013. It's been over 10 years since Litecoin has even come close to visiting its all-time high. And just to kind of reinforce this, every cycle, our highs and our lows have decreased by at least 50%. From first cycle into second cycle, these highs were 50% lower than these highs. And these lows were 50% lower than these lows. And again, the story repeats itself. Second and third, highs down 70%, lows down 60%. Third into fourth, again, it's too early to say, but if we're going to take averages, which is what I've done here, we're down 60% and we're down 55%. Now, assuming that we're going deeper than just saying Litecoin's going to go down on its Bitcoin pair, because that's personally what I think, I don't think there's much hope for Litecoin against Bitcoin. I mean, look, this was the best bull run crypto ever saw. The amount of money that was pumped into the market during these years was unfathomable. And now if I screen grabbed this and showed it to you and said this was a crypto asset during the 2021 bull run, you would laugh at me. And I would probably laugh with you, to be honest with you, because it's pitiful. It's pitiful. One thing to look at with Litecoin on the Bitcoin pair is that 45 weeks before the halving and 45 weeks afterwards, Litecoin trades down, uninterrupted. We saw this the first halving, we saw this the second halving, again for around 89 weeks, for 91 weeks, the second halving. We've currently already had about 45 weeks, 41 weeks, whatever. Oh, and the few that we've had after the halving. So about 46 weeks of this downward moving price. Now, again, if I was going to compare this move to one of the moves we've already had, I would be drawn to the 2016 move, because in the 2016 move, we put in our lows at the halving time, And now if we take a look at what we've done here, kind of recently, we've put in the lows for this cycle at the halving. These are the lows of this cycle, and they're at the halving. These were the lows of this cycle, and they were at the halving. Again, if we're kind of looking at the degree, that's a terrible that's a very sharp decline. That's like 45 degrees. This one's like 38 degrees, and that one's like 28 degrees. So again, it matches up most in terms of severity of the sell-off. So again, it is funny, not just only are we matching up the 2016 kind of time frame to Litecoin now on the Bitcoin pair, we're also of course doing it on the US dollar pair. So it's not just kind of one chart that's representing this, it's at least two anyway. Another thing to maybe kind of look at is that during Litecoin's start, it was kind of much more volatile, but as time has gone on, Litecoin does just seem to have kind of flatlined at a 30-degree decline. If you're averaging it out, we might be about to see this increase to a 40-degree incline with the way this is dropping. Again, it doesn't have to play out in a similar way. And while it is very easy to kind of find lots of similarities and say, oh, well, it's done all these things to the T, so it's going to do the next thing to the T. It doesn't always have to happen like that. But it is very interesting. And it's just the fact that, we've stayed below the bull market support band for this long. We had a similar kind of strong move to the upside, a similar amount of time before the halving here and here. In both of these cycles, we put in our highs at the beginning, kind of in the Q1. We put in a low, bang on halfway through. There's just a lot of similarities. So I feel like it's not too outlandish to assume that we could see more as time plays on. But again, I'm kind of losing my voice, to be honest with you, so I'm going to wrap up this video. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. That's totally fine too. And tell me, is this the bull market, that Litecoin changes everything and it breaks out of this kind of pit of despair that it's been falling in for the last decade against Bitcoin? Does Litecoin have a resurgence, or is it just kind of continuing to crash? I can't see anything happening. I can't see like a GameStop type move here where we, rally up back to our all-time highs and way above them. But it is crypto. Anything can happen. Either way, thanks so much for watching. Take care and peace.